Vanessa.
Hi, Dom.
Happy holidays.
Happy Yuletide season. Is it feeling festive over there?
Yeah, she's asking because Vanessa decided to leave New York just as it was shutting down again, as she does.
Yeah, I guess so.
So we were debating what we should do for Christmas.
And then we thought, what does everybody love? What gives us a glow of seasonal joy to every person, man and child, woman and non-binary person?
And indeed concluded that the one thing that unites the world is dead Jews, the love for dead
There you
Jews,
go.
which is the title of Dara Horn's book, People Love Dead Jews.
Which is a great title.
The actual conversation was more along the lines of, hey, Adam, yes, Vanessa, we need to do something for Christmas, right? Yeah. How about we do the Dead Jews episode? Why? Well, because isn't Christmas ultimately really about the greatest Jew that had ever died?
Did I say that? Was that my joke?
Yep.
Well, if it was funny, I'd take credit for it. If it wasn't, I don't remember.
If it was,
I don't recall.
If it was offensive to someone,
Exactly.
then I'm just libeling you. What I really want to know is who is offended. Who would be offended by this?
Well, if you're not, then no, you're a bad
person. I mean, is it offensive to Jews? Is it offensive to Christians? I don't know.
Right.
Could be offensive to Muslims too. They also have some important role for Jesus in their canon.
We're equal opportunity offenders. Everyone can choose to be offended by us.
I think Hindus would take no offense to any of these. Maybe pagans
Oh
though
yeah.
would.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, because it's really not about Jesus, is it?
I went to a little solstice celebration this weekend. It was fun. Full moon. It was neato.
Wow, going full pagan. Nice.
Anywho,
We have strayed somewhat.
Yeah, we're getting sidetracked from Dara Horn and her excellent book and podcast, Adventures with Dead Jews.
Yes. So Dara Horn is a novelist and a literary scholar, but her recent book and podcast are about her research regarding the unique place that Jews have in the imaginations of non-Jews. She's looked at this question through various perspectives, looking at ways that people have memorialized the death of Jews, the systemic death of Jews in places where anti-Semitism was rampant, and the way that Jews are portrayed in popular media. And the conclusions that she's reached are, as the title suggests, a touch on the macabre side. To oversimplify, her argument is that the collective memory of the West, and actually beyond the West, has only accepted Jews insofar as they have essentially shed off their distinct Jewish identity, this ineffable Jewiness of theirs, and have effectively become just a symbol for a universally oppressed minority, not a specific group with its own cultural, religious, ethnic identity. So in her book, she goes through a myriad of examples of how and why this plays out this way.
And what it serves for the non-Jewish society's imagination. Like she brings up this point again and again. Like the violent death of Jewish people plays a role in the non-Jewish imaginary that is very vivid, and she talks about that and why it matters to non-Jewish society. Yes.
We also talk about contemporary manifestations of anti-Semitism, I think, right? We talk about the U.S.?
Yes, we definitely do. We talk about the Tree of Life shooting and the way that the media demands coverage of those types of events. The ways that they do has made Dara incredibly uncomfortable over the years. And we talk about her grappling with, she herself as a novelist and a journalist responding to these events, her discomfort with being put into these narratives and her attempt to kind of break free of them.
That fits nicely with the worthy, unworthy victims that we've just discussed with Matt Taibbi.
That's true.
But possibly my favorite thing about the book and perhaps the conversation we had with Dara, because she comes from literature, she thinks in terms of story making, and that reaches sort of an apotheosis for me when she's specifically writing about the difference in the way that Jews construct narratives and the way that the Christian European world has done so, and how those two diverged in a profound way.
Mm-hmm.
And then what that means to the way that different societies understand themselves, their actions, and their responsibilities, not to mention the atrocities that they've committed. We do not go into the topic of Israel, I believe, but
No.
that's for another time.
Right.
And this conversation also posed two interesting problems for me, or at least challenges, I should say. First, I think that the problem of identity struggling when in a majoritarian group is a universal problem. And you read the writings of say Franz Fanon about the difficulty of Black people trying to find their place in white majoritarian Western societies, wanting to preserve their own identity, and the fact that they will never really be accepted for what they are in the majority group, or at least the irking suspicion that that's the case. And the second problem is that I've grown up very wary of the more restrictive sides of religion, and specifically Judaism. Every once in a while mention growing up in Jerusalem, you can't help but see how hyper-religiosity can create a lot of constraints on liberal principles and freedoms that I value and see to be part of the basic guarantees of a modern society. Liberal principles that, as we've discussed with Tom Holland, emerge from a very particular time in history in a very cultural context, and maybe are totally incongruent with Jewish history. But at some point, you need to choose how to balance your own, moral portfolio between the more restrictive molding qualities of a small tribal community and some potentially something else, something that is by result, if not by design, more humanist and universal. So that's a challenge. And when we're talking about the problem of Jews and assimilation throughout Europe, I think that's looming there. So that's something that I was trying to broach with Dara. Unfortunately, time was short, so I only got to start scraping this conversation. But I think we got somewhere. But you all feel free to tell me what you think.
And I do highly recommend the podcast, Adventures with Dead Jews. Adam raved about the book, but I do think the podcast is worth mentioning too, because you get some little extra stories, and they do a really good job of getting kind of the magic of audio in there, and like
the magic of audio.
Indeed. And podcast people like podcasts. So if you're listening to this, I assume you like podcasts. So check it out.
Oh, speaking of the magic of audio, I just realized that I forgot to insert the dramatic piano sting when we were talking about Chomsky in our previous episode.
Oh, yes.
That's dereliction of duty.
The magic of audio is also the rating and giving us the good stars so that other people can find the magic that we share.
Oh,
right,
yes.
Adam?
Please give us 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, because
Christmas presents for Adam and myself.
Yes, because that really does make a profound difference in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Also, if you're craving some more despair-driven, anti-partisan, uncertain, ambivalent content, check out our Inscrutable newsletter, which is part of our Uncertain Substack at uncertain.substack.com. All you need to do is go into your setting and just add Inscrutable. In anticipation of our Dead Jews episode, I posted last week a little essay about Spinoza, for instance, if you're interested. It's kind of my manifesto in defense of cognitive dissonance.
Adam's been doing some writing. I've been very proud of him for actually getting some writing done.
And we should also be starting to get some writings from guest contributors as well. Crowd favorite and 3-time guest Misha should be writing a piece for Christmas, I believe.
Maybe I'll even write something in the new year. Let's see. We can hold hope. New Year's resolution. Let's see if I actually make it.
And leave us comments. Write to us on Uncertain Pod on the social media if you want to chat, and share us with your friends and enemies. So, with that,
Dara Horn.
Okay, I think we're good to go. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's a delight to be here in the luminous ether.
So, well, we've gotten used to that existence.
Yeah.
So let's get straight into it. Your book, People Love Dead Jews, brings in a lot of ideas of the role that Jews play in the imagination of the nations. And a lot of it is Jewish history being what it is, morbid. But I want to start with a theme that I found riveting, maybe because we dealt with it previously on the podcast, and that's the challenge of memorializing a tragedy. And specifically, you write about how the way that the stories of Jewish tragedy have been retold throughout the centuries has often had more to do with complementing the vanities of the memorializers, the people who build the museums and write the histories, than actually recording history.
I think that it's less about sort of the memorializers, although that's part of it. It's more that like the book is really about the role that Jews play in this sort of like imagination of a larger non-Jewish societies. So that's really what it's about. People tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves. And, there's a role that is playing. And what I mean by that is there's this sort of this self-flattering thing that's being done where I wouldn't even call them tragedies because that implies, I'm a literary scholar and tragedy is like something you bring on yourself, which is not what's happening here. And that's sort of what I'm pushing back against.
Which is actually aligning the book that, as somebody who's not a literary scholar, I was like, oh, that's a great observation. I completely betrayed that right now in my description. Should use atrocities.
Yes, exactly. Atrocity, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, disasters. Yeah. So it's the role that these disasters are playing, and where it is, and when I say a story that makes people feel better about themselves, that like can take a lot of different forms. And I'm not sure what direction you want to go in with this, but what I was sort of interested in was how it required, in many cases, and in the cases really that I'm exploring in the book, an erasure of like actual living Jews and an erasure of like expressions of Jewish identity among living Jews. So that's why in the opening chapter of the book, I have this example from this Anne Frank Museum in Amsterdam, which is this like, this is the museum where, Anne Frank and her family and, these other people were hiding from the Nazis. And then, this building is now this like blockbuster museum that, is like 2 million visitors a year. And, I just, there's this kind of amazing news story about this, about like the things that this museum was doing with this memory, which like really like explicitly required an erasure of Jewish identity of like currently living Jews. And that was sort of really striking to me. So that's where I sort of started the book in that direction. But
was it a receptionist who's not allowed to wear a yarmulke? Right?
Yes, right, exactly. Yes. So there was somebody who worked at the museum who was a young Jewish employee who was like, the museum would not let him wear his yarmulke to work. They made him hide it under a baseball hat, and then and then like it's a comedy, right? Because then he appeals this decision to the board of the museum, and the board of the museum then deliberates for 4 months and then relents and lets him wear his yarmulke to work. As I put it in the book, like 4 months is a really long time for the Anne Frank Museum to ponder whether or not it was a good idea to force a Jew into hiding. Right? And then it's like something really similar had happened. So again, this was something that happened in 2018. And then the year before, in 2017, there was something weird that happened at this same museum that visitors had noticed with the audio guides. Because like, they have, it's like one of the big international museums, they have like, 15 languages. And they all have like, you go to the audio guide display and it says like English, and there's a little British flag, and it says Francais, there's a little French flag. And it's like, all these flags. And then you get to Hebrew, no flag. And it's like, as I put it I'm like, these might be like PR mishaps, but like, they're not really mistakes.
Right. They're decisions, they're choices.
And they're decisions that are sort of basically, because they're like, oh, these things get in the way of like our museum's message of like, teaching about like the Jews' humanity. And it's like, but like that requires you to like erase like the like identity of living Jews, right? That's like seems to be what you're doing here. It's like very explicit. And so and that's like just like a very glaring example of this, but like it's sort of, throughout the book I sort of go through these other examples where that erasure seems to be a requirement for Jews to be part of these public conversations, and that's sort of what I'm diving into in the book.
So I think the way I was coming into this was sort of assuming with many of the cases that you bring up, whether it's the poet from the Soviet Union or the city of Harbin, that the erasure was part of the point. It was a feature, not a bug to begin with. Nobody loves building monuments to crimes that they've committed. And as such, I find it almost more remarkable that many of these atrocities did get memorialized at all. What's so striking about this story is that we have a minority group that has been oppressed and eradicated by a majoritarian group, not a new story. But then that minority group has been elevated to be some kind of universal symbol that the majoritarian oppressor ends up identifying with. What's up with that?
Yes. Well, so there's a few things to unpack here, and not all of which I make totally explicit in the book. One is like sort of it. Well, certainly in the Anne Frank example, I do think that there's like this sort of unspoken level of Christian belief that's animating a lot of this. That like is sort of like a vestigial kind of Christian belief where it's like these like murdered Jews are supposed to like offer you some kind of absolution from your sins or something. Yeah. So like when I say that the Jews are playing this role in a non-Jewish imagination, like that's what I'm talking about, right? It's that like,
right.
It's like that's and that's why I give that example of like it's like, oh, what's the most famous line from Anne Frank's diaries? This thing where she's like, oh, I still believe in spite of everything that people are truly good at heart. That's the line that they like plaster on the wall of the museum. It's like on the book jacket. It's the thing that's like on your test when like you have this like to read in school. Like, and that's like the reason that line is like so celebrated is because like, as I put it in the book, it's like we feel it inspires us, by which we mean it flatters us, right? Because it makes people feel forgiven for, lapses in Western civilization that lead to piles of murdered girls. And, if a murdered girl said this, then It must be true. But like the reality is like so much simpler, right? I mean, it's like, Anne Frank wrote this line about people being good at heart like 3 weeks before she met people who weren't. Like 3 weeks after she writes this line, she gets arrested and deported to Auschwitz. I'm like, yeah, she met people there who weren't good at heart, right? And like that's sort of like to me is like it requires you to erase all of that, right? And so that's like you also like you get rid of that, and then you get to have this like inspiring story about humanity, right? And so when I say it's playing a role, that's what I mean. So
is there kind of some contortions that need to be done in order to make these types of narratives come through?
Yeah, I mean, and like I said, erasures that need to happen, right? So, and then I mean, there's a lot of them. So, and this also happens, in a lot of situations that have nothing to do with the Holocaust. So, like, and it's the role that Jews are playing in this non-Jewish imagination. Like you said, like the erasure is already there. Well, okay, but then there's a reason people are bringing this back, right? I mean, so I have a chapter. Yeah, so I have a chapter in the in the book about this city in China called Harbin. So I don't know if you want to go there. That's like, take some time to explain what this is.
Well, take all the time you need. I should mention, though, that Vanessa comes from the field of architecture journalism, and we've had a conversation with an architecture critic about the difficulty of striking the right balance with monuments. So we have a baked-in interest in this area.
Okay. Well, so this is a city. Harbin is a city in northeastern China. It's like north of North Korea. It's like south of Siberia. This is it's in this part of China that's traditionally called Manchuria. This city was basically built by Jews, and what I mean by that is like in the like late 19th, early 20th century, the Russians like made an agreement with the Chinese government to like build part of the Trans-Siberian Railroad through this part of Manchuria. They were going to build like this they were building like basically a railroad going deeper into China. They needed an administrative center for this railroad. So basically they needed a town. They needed experienced Russian-speaking entrepreneurs to build this town for them. They're like, the problem is like, who the heck wants to move to Manchuria? And then they're like, hello, Jews. Would you like to, like live without anti-Semitic restrictions but not like have to be a bottom feeder in a New York City sweatshop? Like, here's an option. You can move to Manchuria. And 20,000 Jews moved to the Manchuria and built this city and like built all the infrastructure of this city. And then what happened is like in the 20th century, you have like successive regimes that like make life more and more difficult for them until the last Jewish family is evacuated by the Israeli government in 1962. And then there's today there is like one Jew who lives in Harbin. But what's amazing.
Do they work at the museum?
He is actually employed by the government to restore these Jewish heritage sites.
Okay.
And as I put it in the book, like Jewish heritage sites is like, this is like a broader thing that goes on around the world in like many countries that no longer have any Jews in them and used to. And, this, as I put it in the book, like, this phrase Jewish heritage sites is like this brilliant piece of marketing, right? Because it sounds so much better than like property seized from dead or expelled Jews, right? Like who wants to go to that? So what's amazing about Harbin is that, so there, were basically no Jews in the city. There's this one guy there now. What happened was I think now it's about 15 years ago, the government in this province of China decided to invest $30 million in restoring these Jewish heritage sites. And what's amazing about this to me, and is like, you look at the documentation of this, and they say the quiet part out loud. And what I mean by that is they literally had a conference, and the title of the conference was International Forum on Economic Cooperation Between Harbin and the World's Jews. And the mayor of Harbin gives a speech where he talks about how, we love the Jews so much, like all these wonderful famous Jews like J.P. Morgan and Nelson Rockefeller, who, in case you were wondering, neither of those people were Jewish. But then he makes it really clear, because he's like, the pockets of the money of the world is in the pockets of the Jews, and this demonstrates the wisdom of the Jews. And if we restore these wonderful Jewish heritage sites, Jews will come and give us their money.
Another thing that I remember made me laugh out loud while reading your book, I think I was on the train or something, people were looking at me strange, was that there's a thriving industry, apparently, of business books based on Talmudic wisdom, like the 10 things that the Jewish Bible teaches you about being successful in business.
Yeah, it's like there's apparently like this whole genre in Chinese publishing, which is like, Talmud is the guide to making money. All I can say is, like, I'm studying the Talmud. I haven't gotten to that part yet.
So this was their economic development plan for the city was, let's create heritage sites that bring Jewish tourists and investors to catalyze economic growth in our city. That was the thinking.
Yeah, I mean, like, it really doesn't take a whole lot of thinking to figure out, like, this is really not, like, a great plan, right? But, like, what's amazing is, like, this is, like, driven by this, like, anti-Semitic belief, right? That's what it is. And, they basically, fell in totally to this anti-Semitic belief and are, like, enacting it in these sites. I mean, it's sort of like, and, you see this in a lot of parts of the world. There are a lot of places like this. And so, I mean, what's amazing is, like, these are, like, in a lot of places, the same, regimes that drove the Jews out to begin with. Like, this is not in the book, but, an example of this is in Egypt. I have some stuff in the book about the Egyptian Jewish community, but, like, the Egyptian government basically drove out they had a huge Jewish community that had been there for thousands of years, predated Islam. They, drove out the Jews from Egypt in the 1950s and 60s. Now there are really no Jews. I mean, I think there's like 10 Jews left in Egypt who are, like, elderly people who, like, haven't been able to leave. And they now have, same thing. The Egyptian government has invested all this money in restoring these synagogues in Alexandria and in Cairo. In their case, it's like for even a different cynical reason, which is they want to get funding from UNESCO, right? By, like, showing, like, how wonderful we are and how we're so open-minded and, like, look how diverse Egypt is. But, like, they drove out the Jews and seized all their assets. And now they're like, look at this wonderful Jewish heritage we have in Egypt. So, like, I mean,
So in that case, in the Egypt case, it's like, the Jews become a symbol of how multicultural they are. It's like it's holding a different position for them in their narrative of
so, like,
what they are as a culture.
That example I haven't researched myself, so, like, I don't, but so I, that's just publicly available information. Like, I haven't, that's not, like, my special insight. But, like, I mean, there's these roles that as I say, like, people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves, right? And, what's amazing, though, is in some of these cases, like, at least in, like, the Holocaust examples, like, people hopefully, like, have some idea of what happened in the Holocaust. Like, it's not a secret. Whereas, like, you go to Harbin and, like, you go to their Jewish museum, like, there's nothing in this museum that tells you why this wonderful community doesn't exist here anymore. It doesn't tell you, right? And the same thing in Egypt. Like, there are people in Egypt today who are, like, under the age of 70, like, they're like, oh yeah, everything was wonderful with the Jews. And then, like, they just, like, decided they didn't feel like living here anymore. Like, people really believe that. So, I mean, that's, like, even more insidious because, I mean, at least the Holocaust stuff, like, hopefully people know about the Holocaust. But I mean, it's just like, it's just sort of bottomless, like how many examples of this there are. And so, I mean, that's what I'm exploring in the book in a lot of different ways, and in the United States too. I mean, in different ways.
Yeah, again, and we will get to the United States, but what's so remarkable, and we're still repeating myself, isn't the original atrocity. It isn't the erasure that followed, but it's the fact that at some point the erasing atrocity committing cultures say, well, maybe there's a benefit and advantage to actually retelling this story. And obviously it's all the more entertaining when it's done in that oddly kitschy, tacky way as they did in Harbin, where they displayed the quote unquote authentic Seder plates of the Jewish community and showed a plastic plate that was, I think, made in Colombia or something.
Oh, it was even worse than that. They had like life-size plaster people, kind of like a George Segal kind of things, like life-size plaster people like pose like with furniture. Like there's like a life-size plaster man like sitting at like a CEO type desk behind like a typewriter. And there's a caption that says, real Jewish businessman in Harvard.
Wow.
It's like, it's just like, I mean, it's like cigar store Indian, right? I mean, that's what it is.
Right.
Right.
And it's still just so remarkable that it happened. Come on. I mean, I'm struggling to figure out what to make of it.
Well, I mean, I think that what you're looking at is like, the power of a conspiracy theory. And like, as I said, like the role people are playing in the world's imagination that has like, that requires the erasure of living Jews, first of all. And second of all, requires a total lack of curiosity about like anything about like what Judaism or Jewish culture actually is. Requires a total erasure of like, even, what you even sometimes even of the atrocities that happened. But then also, it's something like it's self-flattering, right? It's also self-flattering because it's like, oh, look, these, like these dead Jews are teaching us some powerful lesson about humanity. Right. Or it's like, there's this like universalizing piece of it, right? Which is it requires the erasure of Jews. And I think that's also part of like, part of what's going on too is, and this, to take us to the United States, is this idea, it's a lip service to diversity that makes people feel better about themselves. And what I mean by that is, I think that there is something that in the United States, we're often, at least like in the time when I was growing up, and I still see it happening even with my children, like the way people are taught to like, to not be bigoted is by giving people this idea that like, oh, see this other group, they're just like you and me. Right. That's like the message. It's like, oh, you shouldn't be prejudiced against Jews because Jews are just like you and me. Jews are just like us. And then this is sort of enacted. You see this like in like Holocaust museums here too, where like this is not in the book, but it's in my podcast, Adventures with Dead Jews. In the opening episode, I talk about the children's exhibit at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. Right. Which is like, it's called like Daniel's story. And you're like walking through this kid's house. And it's like, this like mock-up of this house in Frankfurt. And it's like, this German speaking kid, and he's got like his soccer trophies and like, his dad's war medals and like, his after school snacks or whatever, and then the next room you go to the ghetto or whatever. But like the idea is like kind of shocking is that like, notice they've chosen like a child who's like not particularly religious, speaks a non-Jewish language, right? Who's just like us. Well, meanwhile, 80% of the people murdered in the Holocaust were Yiddish speakers. Like that was the culture was actually destroyed in the Holocaust, was like this like broad, I mean, there are still Jewish communities that speak Yiddish, but like this broad Yiddish speaking culture that included like that had this wide diversity of like religious, secular, many different political parties, many different, aspects of the culture, that it was like that like use of the language was killed. Right. That whole like Yiddish speaking culture was actually destroyed. But like that we don't actually care about. What we're trying to prove is that the person was just like us. Right. And that's the part of that erasure that's happening. And I think it does come from this idea that like, oh, the only way you can empathize with someone is if they're just like you and me. And like, and like, oh, look, they're just like everybody else. And the problem with that in particular, when it comes to Jewish culture, is that like Jews spent 3,000 years not being like everybody else. Right. Like that was sort of like, one of the purposes of Judaism was to not be like everybody else. Right. It's like, Jews were like worshiping a bossy, unsexy, invisible God, like before that was cool. Like, what I mean? It was sort of like, there was like never an attempt to be like everybody else. And that's the piece that's like that's the real erasure. And so I forget how we started with this.
Well, I was going to ask, I mean, do you think that they're necessarily exclusive? Like, is it possible to have a humanizing, empathizing experience in a museum that memorializes a Jewish atrocity that befell Jewish people, and at the same time accurately convey Jewish culture and a Jewish experience or storytelling of that atrocity? Like, do they have to be mutually exclusive?
Presumably in a way that speaks to a non-Yiddish speaker, right? Or somebody that is completely removed from Jewish experience.
Right. Because there is always going to be an active translation no matter what.
Well, I mean, but I think that there's that, I mean, you need to actually care and be curious. You can't be like learning about this because you just want it to be like a nice lesson about humanity. Like, I think when people go to like the Museum of African American Culture in DC, they're not like erasing, they're not like, oh, Black people are just like white people. And it's like, you know, their culture is the same. And it's just like, you know, it's so wrong that we were, you know, people treated them poorly because like, no, it's like it celebrates like the development of African American culture, right? I mean, it's like, why would you not do that, right? Like, and there are like, there are other ways you can do this, but you would have to actually value the diversity, right? You would have to actually care what the content of that civilization is. An example I've often given about this, and again, which is, I don't quite say this in the book, but if you think about like the way people, I sort of say in the book, but not quite, but like, think about like the way people learn about Jewish culture at all in like a public, you know, in public education. If you think about like, you know, like a social studies textbook in middle school or high school or something like that, like what does it say about Jews in like a world history textbook? There's probably like a page near the, if it has ancient history in it, there's like maybe a page at the beginning that's like about the Israelites. Does not mention that those people were Jews, like they're just old people from a long time ago, like they might as well be Phoenicians, whatever, they're dead. And then like, you know, at the end of the book, if it has modern history in it, there's a chapter about the Holocaust. And that's kind of it, right? And so it's like, you know, but the thing is like, there's two problems with this. Like number one, like, you know, Jews are sort of like fundamental to the history of the West. Like you have like the entire Western civilization is like based on Jewish culture when you think about Christianity and Islam. Like you sort of can't really tell this story accurately without telling this story. And so that's like an erasure piece also. So I mean, so you could say like, oh, it's just like some small group. Like, yeah, there's probably not a chapter about the Yazidis either. Okay. But like the Yazidis did not have this vast influence on these other cultures. If I was writing a history of Syria, maybe I would have a chapter about the Yazidis. But if you're writing history about, you know, about the history of the West, like you kind of need to talk about this. The other thing is that like, you know, Judaism is this counterculture that's run through the entire history of the, I mean, I would say the history of the world, but really the history of the West, which like really like sort of would call into question a lot of things that that we believe about history. And it would kind of like mess up the story in a way that like, as I say, would not make people feel good about themselves. And what I mean by that, and I'm going to give like a very tiny example of this. This is something I didn't talk about in the book, but I do talk about it in my podcast. Very tiny example of this is like, if you think about like the way you learn about literacy in like your, you know, history class in high school or middle school, like, you know, what you usually learn is like, you know, there was, you know, until the invention of the printing press, like people really didn't know how to read. It was only like the nobles and the clergy and like these wealthy people had the opportunity to learn how to read, but nobody else knew how to read. And then the printing press, technology, hooray, you know, and then you have industrial production, you know, with the Industrial Revolution, hooray. Now like there's like technology and access, and now suddenly, hooray, we can have mass literacy, like poor people can also learn how to read. I mean, it's a nice story, but like if you include Jewish history and world history, it turns out to be a total lie because you had universal male literacy in Jewish communities all over the world for at least 1,000 years before the printing press. So like, you know, like poor Jewish kids in rural Libya in the 7th century all knew how to read, right? Poor Jewish kids in 12th century Yemen learned how to read. You know, poor Jewish kids in 9th century Spain learned how to read. Poor Jewish kids in 13th century Poland learned how to read. So it's like, the problem is like, if you include that story, it kind of ruins the other story because what it really reveals is actually you don't need advanced technology to have mass literacy. You just need a society that like cares about reading. Right. So I mean, it really would kind of undo a lot of things. And so that's what I mean about curiosity. So like to answer your question from earlier about, you know, what does it mean? You know, like, can you include this story, you know, while still having this, you know, story about these atrocities? Like, well, yeah, and it would be a lot more interesting, right? It would be a lot more interesting. It would challenge a lot of things that people believe about themselves. You know, I would like kind of like upend a lot of things that we believe. And I think, you know, I mean, it would also be more true to reality, right? Because most of the people who died in the Holocaust were not kids who were on the soccer team. A lot of them were Hasidim. Well, does that change the way you look at Hasidim now if we're feeling all this like empathy for Hasidim who were murdered in the Holocaust? And I don't see that empathy now. So, you know, that's sort of like, you know, it would really change things. It would really, you know, and it would impose a requirement, which I think we should have in this country and that we're fighting for in a lot of ways, of like actually respecting, you know, really having a pluralistic society where you respect different, you know, different points of view and different histories and different cultures and different beliefs. as opposed to like this idea of diversity where it's like we have a lot of people who maybe come from different places, but like all think the same way.
So somebody who grew up in Israel and has for his entire life struggled with this balance between, an urge for assimilation and embracing some of the aspects of the West that I care about, while also recognizing the specific context in which I grew up, nationally, politically, culturally. And I think it's not uncommon for Israelis to find an appeal in that Christian universalist vision of the West. And I think that in your book, at least I felt that in your book, you were expressing a degree of anger and even resentment towards Jews that were flirting with some sort of assimilation, who were partaking in their own erasure, as it were.
Okay, yes. So yes, I have a lot of thoughts about this. Okay, well, but when you say, like, so this is like something, there's a place in the book where I talk about sort of two different forms of anti-Semitism that can be distinguished by like the holidays that like in the Jewish calendar that celebrate overcoming them, which is Purim and Hanukkah. So like, there's sort of like,
I love that observation.
Yeah. So like Purim is like, is based on the biblical book of Esther, where there's, this, it's like super obvious. There's like, it's like, bad guy comes and it's like, let's kill all the Jews, moo ha ha ha, right? Like it's nothing subtle about this. Like you really can't miss this. So, and that's like, that's like, there are a lot of parallels to that in contemporary history too. I mean, various genocidal regimes, like, fine. Not subtle, right? So, but then there's like Hanukkah anti-Semitism, which is about, there's this like Hellenized regime Hellenistic regime. They're not from Greece, they're actually from Syria, but details, whatever, that takes over ancient Judea. And their goal is still to destroy Jewish culture, but not by necessarily kill all the Jews. Instead, it's like, we're not going to kill all the Jews. The goal is still to flush Jewish civilization down the toilet, but we're going to do it this other way where we're basically going to edit how people are allowed to be Jewish. Right.
Or at least dilute it.
Yes. We're going to make rules about like how Jewish you can be. And so what happens, the problem with that, that form of anti-Semitism is like, it's like less, it's more insidious, because what happens with that form of anti-Semitism is it requires Jews to participate in their own erasure. Right. So like it requires Jews to like, in a sense, to be in some way agents of this. Right. So one example is like in this Hellenized regime, like they recruited teenage Jewish boys as athletes, right? Because this, like, there's this, and I don't pretend to understand, there's this whole thing in Hellenistic culture with athleticism and these arenas. Somehow it has something to do with the religion. I don't pretend to understand it, but whatever. They're all like playing sports in the nude. This is like what you see in all these Greek sculptures. So these teenage Jewish boys had their circumcisions reversed so that they could participate in these games. Because like participating in the game wasn't just like, oh, I'm playing a game. Like this was like, it would be like, the equivalent of like having a social media account. It's like the only way to matter in this society, right? So like these people, you could say they voluntarily did this, but it's like, how voluntary was it, right? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, and then it sort of becomes this like spectrum of voluntary, right? Where like there's this, they need to sort of edit themselves, literally, physically in this case, right? They literally have to edit themselves in order to be socially acceptable. Right. And so, and you see that like in, there's a lot of like different regimes over time where that happens. In the book, I talk about the Soviet regime, which was doing that very explicitly, where they're like, well, it's like, we're not anti-Semitic, but like, here's like 10 things you can't do, which include like, practicing Judaism. Right. So it's like, we're not anti-Semitic. We just, won't let you practice Judaism. Right. So, that's the problem, right? It's like, there's this requirement that like, there's this imposition from the outside on how you're able to express or engage in this culture. Right. And that there's like these parameters placed around it. So like, I don't feel this. Yeah. So like when you say like Jews participated in that, like, yeah. Because that form of anti-Semitism requires that self-erasure.
So where I want to push back, obviously, in the case of Hellenism, it's a completely different story. Although it's much more difficult to suss out the details of the mindsets of the individual Jews who were participating in this and what was the external pressure. But there is the version of it where it's more like the American Jew or the Jew in Germany in the 19th century. They're trying to figure out a balance between the community that they belong to and also the repressive elements of that community, the repressive elements that are required in order to preserve the mold of the unique identity, all while being tempted, on the other hand, by the slow development of a liberal society, where they're starting to see new civil and political and sexual and professional freedoms and opportunities that were in tension with the old community. And of course, given the prevalent anti-Semitism in Western Europe, a Jew who wanted to join the new quote-unquote open society probably had to renounce his ties to the old community and shed the traditional accoutrement of Jewishness. At a minimum, they probably had to change their name, as you mentioned in your book.
Yes.
But my point is that there were just so many forces involved there, and I'm not an expert in the topic, but I do base some of my knowledge on a friend of mine who did her PhD in the story of converted Jews in Western Europe and the beginning of a secularization and assimilation. But at some point, it just becomes so impossibly thorny to try and point exactly what was the epistemological state that drove a Jew to cast away or put behind his home and tradition and try his luck in the new secular Christian modern world. A move which often meant facing ostracism and excommunication from one's own family. And we can see still some echoes of this debate playing out in our world turned utterly globalized and utterly Christian, as Tomer Persico and Tom Holland would say. We find the debate going on between people who are strident assimilationists and people who are hoping to see us returning to a more splintered, culturally siloed world. And I don't know exactly where I fall in this debate, but I do remember growing up in Jerusalem being very leery of anybody who was too critical of secularization and too defensive of the more inhibitive aspects of Judaism.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that resonates.
No, it is. Look, I wrote my PhD on this too, because my PhD is in Yiddish and Hebrew literature. But my period was in, like late 19th, early 20th century Hebrew and Yiddish literature. This is the whole foundation of modern Hebrew and Yiddish literature, is people who left this traditional life by choice, right? And basically what happened was, though, is like these people left this traditional life and they had nowhere to go, right? Because these were writers who were living in Eastern Europe at a time where like the wider society was not an open society. It was not welcoming to them. And so they were sort of like, then they really didn't have anywhere to go with this. And their art comes from that tension and is developed within that tension. So, I mean, I know a whole lot about this too. What I think is interesting though, is I spent 20 years of my career dealing with that question. And I also spent 20 years of my career not writing this book. And what I mean by that is this is my 6th book. I have 5 novels I published before this book. And my novels are all about Jewish history, Jewish culture, history, religion, belief. And it's like all like sort of filtered through this sort of contemporary world, but also going back in time. And like, I was doing that like partly because like I was also like sort of in the role in the sense of those writers who were, that I had been studying for my doctorate, where I was like, I'm writing in English. I'm living in a much more open society than any of those writers ever did. But at the same time, like I want to draw on this, I'm trying to draw on these languages and texts in a way that like I can't, unlike those writers, I can't assume that my readers know these things. And I'm introducing these things to my entirely, very broad audience, which is like, because obviously I have readers from many different backgrounds who are reading my work in English and in many other languages in translation. So, I've made that world accessible to all of my readers. So, I mean, this is something like I was like really pushing back against I always wanted this tradition to all the choices that people made in this tradition and inside and outside of it and all those things. I always like wanted to like lean hard on that idea that these were all autonomous decisions. Right. And like everything I was doing as a scholar was pointing in that direction. Like I like always like was really disturbed by this idea that like Jewish tradition was like defined by this like external forces, right? Like that always like really troubled me and I always pushed away from it. And then with this book, like I just like hit a wall basically in the last like 5 years where I'm just like, I mean, I could talk about how I got there, but to go to your previous point about sort of in the United States, it really like the wall I've hit in the past 5 years about this like kind of made me reconsider a lot of these things because it made me realize. So, for example, like to go to the example of the United States, I have a chapter in the book about this like mythology of Ellis Island, right? Like that, which is this legend that like there was we had this fill in the blank Jewish sounding last name. And then there was this like bumbling immigration clerk at Ellis Island who wrote down our name in this, other way. And now we have this like much less Jewish sounding last name instead. Ta-da! Right. And this is like this mythology, right? It never happened. Nobody in Ellis Island ever wrote down anyone's names. That never happened. And this is not like me and my secret research. Like this is something they announce on public tours of Ellis Island, right? I mean, this is
Wow,
not,
okay.
like, yeah. But also like, and it's not just that, like we also have court records from.
Well, of course they would say that. Our clerks were great.
Right, it's like QAnon, whatever. Like, yeah, they don't want you to know. Yeah, like no, but like we have court records of tens of thousands of petitions to New York City Civil Court of American Jewish immigrants and also their children. A lot of these were their children who changed their names, who like went to court to change their names. And again, this is not my research. This is a historian named Kirsten Vermeglich who wrote a great book called A Rosenberg by Any Other Name, which is a great title. And it's about this, like she tracks these court filings and like, look, there were other immigrant groups that did this too, but like what she says is like, you go through these court filings and it's like overwhelming majority are Jewish sounding names. She's like, you're in this archive, in the court archives, and you're just like, she's like, it's just pages and pages and pages of Cohen's.
Right.
And what's amazing to me in like looking at this was sort of like that, like, and she also like tracks these people and she says, like these were not people who like they stayed, they continued their lives. Like these weren't people were not people like those writers who left the shtetl and moved to some big city and stuff. These were people like they stayed, like they were still members of synagogues, like they still like lived in their mostly Jewish neighborhoods, like they were still contributing and participating in Jewish communal life. Like these were not like self-hating Jews who were fleeing Judaism. And so then it's like, why were these people doing this? They were staring down a reality that they could not avoid. So, like today, like, in the United States, we talk about like, anti-Semitic incidents. Like in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, like it wasn't about incidents, right? I mean, this was like about people like couldn't rent an apartment. Like you couldn't get a job, right? I mean, this was like really like not like, this is a pervasive atmosphere. And, this is like, these people were not like, I want to, this wasn't like this autonomous choice in the sense that these people were like, I, want to be part of a universalist society. These people were like, I want my kid not to get beat up on the way home from school. So like, that's not really like, and I sort of like realizing that was like really kind of, and then you realize like that legend was these people's way of protecting their descendants.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like that was like, they were sheltering their descendants from that psychological damage, right? Which like, look, I kind of, I'm sort of like, thank you.
And to be clear, this is different. The people who changed their names didn't necessarily had to leave their culture.
Yes, that's my point. Yeah, that's exactly my point, is that those are two different things, right? The person who like voluntarily like, is like, I'm sitting in this yeshiva wasting my life. I hate this. I want to like go do something else with my life. That's not the same story as the person who's like, I can't get a job with this last name.
So you're talking about the wall that you hit. I'm not sure if it connects or not, but there's a line that I marked for myself in the introduction to your book that just made me go, woof. Let me find it. You're reflecting on all the 50 plus countries that you've visited. And you write, the more you travel, and I'm quoting, the more I notice the differences between myself and the inhabitants, and the more alienated, uncomfortable, and anxious I become. This just describes to me the retreat on a personal level from this ideal of universality that we are all part of the human family. So I just was suddenly wondering if that feeling had any role in conceiving the book.
No, I feel like that because that predates the book, right? So that's like something I talk about, like, that I sort of, I grew up traveling a lot with my family of origin, and I still do this now. And that's why, like I said, I've been to like 50 or more countries. And like, that's just something like that I feel like is more to do with like being a writer, honestly. I feel like being a writer is just sort of like, there's just always like this invisible wall between, I mean, I don't know, this is how my experience, this is how I experience my life. It's like, I just feel like there's always this like invisible wall between me and like everyone around me. It's very upsetting when I think about it. So but I felt this is something that, you try to bridge this wall with language, and it doesn't always work.
And story.
And I think that's, I don't know, I think that's probably true for a lot of like creative artists in general, that you sort of feel this like kind of deep alienation from like everyone around you, or so that particular line, I think probably says a lot more about me than it says about these like larger problems of, anti-Semitism or whatever. But like, but no, the wall I hit in the last few years was sort of like, has more to do with like, rising anti-Semitism in the United States in the past 5 years, and sort of, And not even just that, but also just like the way I, as a writer, was expected to respond to it. So, and I talked to you before about this, this piece I wrote about Anne Frank. I actually wrote that piece because I was asked by Smithsonian Magazine to write that piece. Like, they approached me, like, this is in 2018, they approached me and were like, we want you to write this essay about Anne Frank for our whatever issue. And I remember getting that request and just feeling this deep sense of dread. I'm like, oh crap, I really don't want to write about Anne Frank. And so the intelligent thing to do would be turn this assignment down. But first of all, maybe I'm not that thoughtful about what I do and not very logical in what it motivates me. But that's part of being a writer also, is failing to follow logical things. But also I think that something I've noticed always in my work as a writer is that the uncomfortable moments are where the story is. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's the moment when you start feeling that uncomfortable, whether it's alienated or whatever it is, that's where the story is. And so I was sort of when I was realized wow, I really don't want to write about Anne Frank. I was sort of stop myself and I'm like, why don't I want to write about this? What is it about this? And that's when I remembered I had read about this, that stupid thing with the guy with the yarmulke at the museum. That was a news item I had read, a couple months earlier. And then in going back to find that news item, I found this other thing about the audio guide with the Israeli flag. And I was sort of wow. And I'm and that really made me realize, in this kind of role that sort of universalizing Holocaust education was playing. And also the role that I was expected as a writer to play in it. I hadn't previously written for Smithsonian Magazine. They came and found me, they approached me and they're like, hey, come write about dead Jews. And and not in a mean way. I mean, mm-hmm. It was a very, and it was an editor I had worked with before when she had been at a different publication. I mean, it was it was very, it was none of that. That's what was interesting to me is it wasn't malevolent intent, right? I mean, it wasn't Smithsonian Magazine. It's not they were trying to they weren't pulling a Harbin where they were trying to profit off this or something. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that, right? But there was still this kind of creepiness to it. And then what happened was that piece came out in one of their fall issues in 2018, and it came out it was a week later there was the shooting at the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh, and then it was within hours of that attack, the New York Times called me and were like, "Oh, do you want to write about this?" And I was again, this feeling of deep dread, and then also feeling wow, this is really uncomfortable. I really don't want to do this. But then in that case, feeling well, if I say no, then who are they going to ask next? Right? Someone's going to have to say yes to this in the next 24 hours, and sort of feeling I had some kind of responsibility, and then just feeling wow. And then it's 6 months later, then there's another shooting and it happens again. And as I put it in my book, I'm wow, I'm the go-to person for this emerging literary genre of school shooting op-eds. I didn't apply for this job. Right. And that was sort of what was interesting to me is I just started noticing that my editors at mainstream publications, this is what they wanted me to write about. Right. And that was sort of got interesting to me because it's in this time where you have all these attacks. And then when it really got interesting was when, at the attacks on the Hasidic community that started happening right before the pandemic, they're not calling me about that. And that I thought was really interesting and telling. So, I mean, you just sort of hit this wall.
What did you take from that, from not being called to write about the Hasidic attacks?
That I think is really interesting because I think they're what I did at that point was I looked at all the news stories about, there were, I mean, quite a few attacks actually, but two that were lethal. I looked at all the news coverage of those attacks, and I almost couldn't find a news story that didn't say something derogatory about the community being attacked in the process of reporting the attack. And that was really striking to me. And it was I'll give an example of this. So
it's the last legitimate outlet for victim blaming.
Yes. And I hesitate to say, I mean, I do say in the book, I don't, I wouldn't say you would never say this about any other group, because I'm sure there's examples of this with other groups, but I did go and look at all the coverage of the Pulse nightclub shooting from 2015, which was, this shooting at this LGBTQ nightclub. There's nothing like that about that. And so, I mean, just to explain what I saw in these articles, it was, the victim blaming. So in the article about there's this Jersey City shooting, it was at a kosher grocery store in Jersey City, which I live in New Jersey, is very close to where I live. And this was a Satmar community, so it's like a Hasidic community. All of these news articles are like, talk. I could not find a news article that didn't talk about, for example, this Hasidic community was gentrifying a minority neighborhood. And not just using that phrase, but like even more like, they were like, going door to door and offering Brooklyn prices for these people's apartments. And like, as I put it in my book, I was like, I'm a homeowner. I've had people approach me asking me if I wanted to sell my home. Like, I said no. I suppose, using a gun would also have made these people go away. Like, it's sort of this crazy, like, gentrifying a minority neighborhood. And I'm just like, well, this is interesting for a few reasons. Number one, like the reason that these people are moving to Jersey City is because they're fleeing gentrification because they got priced out of Brooklyn. Right. Number one. Number two, like these are highly visible members of like the world's most historically persecuted minority. And number three, like, is there this murderous rage against gentrification that people are like, walking into Blue Bottle coffee with automatic weapons and like blowing away white hipsters? I don't think that's been happening. So it's like, I don't think the gentrification is the problem here. Right. And then it's like, the same thing, very similar situation. Like there was this stabbing attack, machete attack in Muncie, New York. So this is, it's like a small town upstate New York where it's like, a large Hasidic community. And somebody like, this was like right before the pandemic, somebody like walked into like a crowded Hanukkah party with a 4-foot machete and just started like slashing people. And, like, all like, I don't know, 5 people were in critical condition, like with like amputated limbs. Like one guy died and a few months later he was in a coma. So, I mean, you read the articles about that attack, like you read them and they say things like, oh, well, there was, just for context, there was this big zoning battle between Hasidic and non-Hasidic residents of this town. First of all, the perpetrator was from a town 45 minutes away. So yeah, I don't think he really cared that much about the zoning issues in this town. Second of all, like, do we normally resolve municipal disputes with a machete? Because silly me, I left mine at home before the last school board meeting, right? Like what is going on here? Like, and then you just realize like these articles are sending a signal, right? And the signal they're sending is that these people deserve it. That was what was really shocking to me. Maybe not shocking, but disturbing. Unfortunately not shocking. But like, it's like, they're sort of like, what they're basically saying is like, this is okay. And that was like, really revelatory to me. And it's like, there's a reason the New York Times is not asking me to write about this attack. We can all get behind like, people in Pittsburgh were shot at this like liberal synagogue where people have the same hairstyle as you. They're just like you and me. The problem is like, apparently once people are not just like you and me, it's like fine to like hack them with a machete. Like I find this problematic.
Right. And so when you see this like the rise of anti-Semitic incidents happening and attacks, do you draw the connection to the way we've memorialized? In your mind, is it like the way we're memorializing is part and parcel of the way that we're the way that in the American imagination or Western imagination, like the symbols that Jews play, and therefore it is somehow excusing or fomenting anti-Semitic attacks?
Well, I mean, it's telling you that Jews are only acceptable if they're powerless or dead. Right. I mean, that's basically what they're saying. So, I mean, like the other thing is like, I want to be, really clear about the thing with the attacks on the Hasidic community is that like, it's, it's not like these people are attacking the Hasidic community, people in the Hasidic community because they like disagree with Hasidic practice and belief. Like they're attacking these people because they're visible. The end. Like, that's all. Like this is not like an objection to like, gender roles in the Hasidic, you know what I mean? Like there's just, it becomes this like huge gaslighting thing that goes on, but it's like, that's not why people are being attacked at all. Right. And so to connect it to your question about, the memorialization, I think that they play a similar role in that what those memorials are doing is making people feel like they have a way to feel good about this where they're not responsible. So I think that also is a huge role of like Holocaust memorialization in the United States, because the Holocaust didn't happen in the United States. So like you can go to a Holocaust museum as an American and like feel awesome about yourself because you're like, whatever crap is going down here is not as bad as this. I mean, that's the other thing. Is like when I say it makes you feel better about yourself, true for Europeans, true for anybody. Like we all look awesome compared to Hitler, right? I mean, that makes everybody feel great about themselves. And I mean, that's sort of like this sort of self-serving piece of it. And I mean, the other problem, and I talk about this in the book, is that like, yes, like we should all learn about the Holocaust so we don't repeat it. But like that has come to me. I mean, that's like come to mean that like anything short of the Holocaust is like, it's not like it's kind of no big deal. Like, I mean, the bar is a little high, right? I mean, it's like, well, we didn't murder 6 million people, so we're good. I mean, and I think
wake me up when they haul out the crematorium.
Right. I mean, it's like there's sort of like this ridiculous, like, in the book, there's one point where I'm like, here's a bunch of things that aren't the Holocaust. And it's like I list everything from like trolling Jews on social media to like forcing Jews out of entire countries and seizing all their assets. Like all of these things, they're not the Holocaust. They're no big deal. Right. I mean, and that's sort of like, and I think that you see this, when you said like tying contemporary anti-Semitism to this, it's not that it's not that the Holocaust memorialization causes this. That is false. But you see that it's not productive. So like, one of the reasons we have, so many of these museums, I mean, and it is the Jewish community that, built a lot of these museums in the United States. And the idea behind it was really that this would be like a way of inoculating the American public against anti-Semitism, right? Because the idea was like people would come to these museums, they'd see like, where hatred can lead, what the world did to the Jews, and they would then stop hating Jews. I mean, okay, well, like, this has been like, we've had like 30 years of these museums. Like, is this working? I mean, I think we can maybe reevaluate this. And the problem is like, now it happens that like, any like public figure who like says something like, vaguely anti-Semitic, like they get dragged to the Holocaust Museum. And then they like make some bland statement about how this is bad. And it's like, well, because that doesn't cost anyone anything, right? They don't have to like, I mean, like, how hard is it to say Nazis are bad? I mean, unfortunately, apparently hard for some people, but like, I mean, this is like a very low bar, and that like, you can drag whatever member of Congress who said whatever offensive thing, and then they can go to the Holocaust Museum and be like, yeah, this is sad. It's like, well, okay, yeah, it's sad. But like, then that person does not have to engage with like living Jewish culture at all. They don't have to think about like whatever it was that, they don't have to like, engage with like anything of substance, right? That has anything to do with anything happening now. Like they're absolved. I mean, it's kind of like that, like Anne Frank gave us all grace, right? I mean, it's something like that kind of dynamic happening. So I don't think that it's not one doesn't cause the other. Right. But like you do see the limitation. Like if the premise was that like Holocaust education was supposed to prevent anti-Semitism, like I do think maybe we should reevaluate that, because I'm not, I mean, the interesting thing is like, it's like when, like if you're like being trolled on social media and they're like, they're like photoshopping Jews into gas chambers, like the problem is not that person doesn't know about the Holocaust.
Right.
They definitely know about the Holocaust.
Yeah. I always wonder about these things, like when I'm leaving a museum, like I found that they try to get you like all interactive right before you leave, and they try to make sure that you're somehow like, I feel like I read about a museum that like has stones, and you take a stone home with you, and it's supposed to like memorialize your commitment to never forget about XYZ thing that you learned about. And I'm always very skeptical about those. I'm skeptical to the extent to which a museum can play that role to really allow you to internalize for the rest of your life and somehow change your life direction. I mean, maybe that's the noble goal. Maybe we should be asking museums to do that, but I feel like they rarely actually do it.
Well, I mean, I think that, if you believe in like the possibility of education, right? I mean, you have to believe that people can be changed by teaching them things. I mean, it can happen in 2 hours in a museum. It's not going to probably happen from only 2 hours in a museum, but if that, is part of a larger thing, okay. But I want to give an example. I don't think the problem is like museum education. I think it's I think again, it's like this idea, it's this requirement that like, this erasure of living Jews in the Holocaust memorials that troubles me. So, and I'm going to give an example of a museum that does the opposite of this. And I have not been to this museum, so I cannot like actually evaluate it. There's a museum in Warsaw that opened about 10 years ago called Polin, which is like the opposite of this. And what I mean by that is that it is not a museum about the Holocaust. It is a museum of the history of Jews in Poland. And it covers like 1,000 years of Polish Jewish history. And so like you go to that museum and it's like, it's like about all these different Hasidic dynasties. It's about like, Jewish political parties and like the socialist movement and like, and literary history and Jewish, Yiddish theater and about like, the Hebrew school network. And like, it's about all these, and also like, the role of Jews in Polish culture as well. And so it's like, it covers all those things. It's not about the destruction of this culture. It's about the content of this culture. I mean, like, and I mean, apparently it's like popular and people are interested. And like, and when I say people, it's like, these are not, people who are mostly Jews. These are, it's like, there aren't a whole lot of, I mean, not a whole lot of Jews in Poland today. So, I mean, it's mostly non-Jewish Poles who are interested in this. So, I mean, I think that like, I think that that's, I mean, if that's like a better way of doing this, again, I haven't been to that particular museum, so it's not really fair for me to evaluate, but like, I mean, it is possible to do this better.
A huge problem with the memorialization of the Holocaust is that, to a large extent, the world's fascination with it is really a more prurient, pornographic interest in the magnitude of the horror and in Nazi aesthetic. But the fact that the Jews were the primary target was completely incidental. I mean, it wasn't incidental to Hitler or to the actual victims, but it's totally irrelevant to the gazillion manga comics and films that use the Holocaust or the Nazi regime as the setting for the story, and the Nazi uniform, the SS uniform, as the coding for villainy. That's why films like Star Wars can contain Nazi aesthetic and Nazi allegories and even hints of a genocide, but less likely to have any reference to what really happened and to whom. So I want to ask you about. I'm gonna segue and ask you about possibly my favorite chapter, which is narratives of fictional dead Jews. So I love this because this ties into your origin story as an author and literature scholar. So if you don't mind, give us the backstory, and then I have a question.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So my comment there is that this comes from my graduate work in. So I have a doctorate in comparative literature, and my languages within that were Yiddish and Hebrew. So I mean, and I maybe had to pass some exams in other, because I think you needed 4 or 5 languages. So I did some other things, but I really was focusing on Yiddish and Hebrew. But my training was in comparative literature. And when you do that, like, you have to take all these like courses in like the history of literary theory and criticism. And I was sort of like interested, and also I was writing novels at the same time. And I just like, I opened that chapter with this like message I got from one of my readers who like wrote me this like really like kind of crazy email where she was like, I was reading one of your books, and this was a book I wrote that happened to be about a pogrom survivor. And she's like, and I got to this scene where the horse is being beaten, and I threw the book across the room because, I think that, it's really more important for us to like, write stories that make people laugh and enjoy and feel uplifted, thanks, Denise. And I'm like, I wrote a reply to Denise, which I was intelligent enough not to send, where I'm like, dear Denise, sorry about the horse. It was based on a scene from Crime and Punishment, which is another book that you probably want to avoid. Right? I'm like, you also want to steer clear of the Hebrew Bible, not a great book for people who want to laugh and enjoy and be uplifted. But like in reading, like I've been thinking very carefully about this idea as a novelist of like what readers want out of a story, because my readers tell me. Right? Like I'm like hearing from readers, that's an extreme example. And like, I wouldn't have been able to publish 5 novels if most of my readers didn't like what I was doing. But like, I am like in dialogue with like real readers who are like, who are like commenting on my work. And in this literary theory courses, I came across this, one of the people we read was this mid 20th century, he's actually British literary critic. I think I mistakenly call him American in the book, called Frank Kermode. And he has a book called The Sense of an Ending. And this is this like theory where he basically says that our expectations of literature actually come from religion. And what he means by that is that we want to live in a coherent world. And so in the same way that like, fundamentalist believers of whatever religion, like you sort of like see everything as like a sign from God, like everything happens for a reason. He's like, well, in a book, everything really does happen for a reason, and everything really is a sign because like the writer made it that way. Like, like when you're writing a novel, like I'm not like, there's no random details in a novel. Like everything there is placed there by the artist for a particular purpose. And for him, he says like this purpose is to drive us toward this redemptive ending, right? And so he basically says like, the whole idea is that you're building out this narrative arc, and that's what Western religion does. And he gives this example where he says like, oh, the Bible is a very good example of this narrative arc. It begins at the beginning with the words in the beginning, and it ends with the vision of the end with the words, even so, come Lord Jesus. And I'm like, well, first of all, that's not how I thought the Bible ended. But second of all, I started thinking about this, and I was like, is there this, the Hebrew Bible like doesn't like end with a like ta-da, like it really kind of doesn't, like, and especially like in like the Torah doesn't, like, they at the end of the Torah, like they don't even make it into the promised land. right? Like it's like a cliffhanger, right? I mean, there's sort of this like idea,
And Chronicle just peters out.
yeah, right. I mean, sort of. Well, I mean, it continues is the idea. So like, there's always like a sequel, and I started thinking about this, and I started thinking about like what I was, the expectations that I felt imposed on me as a novelist, which were like, think about what and I realized that like this idea of this narrative arc is actually Christian, right? It's not like from religion in general. It's from Christianity, because like and if you think about what we expect as English language readers from a story, like you expect the good guys to be saved, right? If that doesn't happen, expect there to be like the main character should have an epiphany, or there should be like a moment of grace, like these are all very Christian terms. And what I started realizing is I was in the meantime I was studying Hebrew and Yiddish literature, and like none of the writers I was reading, like they never gave you any of those things. Like in Yiddish literature, it's like nobody's ever saved. Like there's nobody ever like has an epiphany or a moment of grace. Like nobody realizes anything. Nobody, like, I don't know. Like it was sort of like just a different, like I just was like, these things are not happening. Like in like, in the Hebrew and Yiddish literature that I was reading in these Jewish languages, like instead there was like this different kind of expectation of like where a story was going, which was more based on like the idea of resilience rather than the idea of redemption. And I sort of saw that repeatedly in a lot of the works I was reading. I mean, is it going to be true for every single book? No, nothing's true for every single book. But like, it was just a very clear pattern in what I was reading. And I sort of was like, there's this idea of this narrative arc that that's supposed to land you in this uplifting place. Like my reader Denise said, where it's like, well, a book is supposed to uplift you and make you feel, again, it's like make you feel good about yourself. And I'm like, I don't think that's what literature is for. And it made me like, I was thinking about this like really, less as a student than as a practitioner, like as a writer of novels, and thinking like, what do my readers expect of me, in providing this kind of arc and this ending? And I was just like looking through like, literature in Jewish languages, it just like doesn't give you that. And like, that was sort of like really striking to me. So that was a lot of detail. So I don't know if that's
Yeah, no, I was just so excited reading this chapter, and I had to bring it up because
that's really interesting.
As I was reading it, it clicked to me because it's something that I never really put together, but it's so obvious when you grow up on Yiddish and Hebrew literature. I was immediately thinking on one of my favorite authors, Shai Agnon.
Yes.
His stories just end.
Yes.
You read them and they just end, and they go nowhere in the traditional sense.
Yes.
It's 500 pages of things just happening, and then it ends.
Yes, exactly.
And leaves you in a weird state. And I think that's why it was so important for me to bring this up in this podcast, because it's really the heart of what we do here. And it's this feeling of uncertainty, of unmooredness, of absurdity.
Exactly.
And you just, as a reader, need to endure through it with maybe even a degree of apathy.
Well, it's not apathy. No, it's not apathy. It's the point of what it's like. Well, there's a couple things. Like one is like that, they're calling out the lie of this other art in that like they're saying that like you can't be true to the human experience while pretending to make sense of the world. Right. So like that's calling out the limit. It's like the art in Jewish literature is like it's about the limitations of art. Right. So that's part of it. But then also that's like very deeply embedded in Jewish texts, like ancient Jewish texts. Right. I mean, it's like when you study the Talmud, like they're just like having all these arguments, and like the arguments aren't resolved. Like they don't like sort of say like, and ta-da, the winner is so-and-so. And especially like, even
sometimes God's voice does come down and resolve the argument.
But even when God's voice comes down, they don't accept it. Right. There's this story of they don't. This is a great story of the oven of Achnai. I don't know if I want to bore your listeners.
Right, of course.
Like, yeah, I mean, there's literally a story in the Talmud. It's like probably the most famous story in the Talmud, where it's like, these two dudes are like having a fight about something, and one guy's like, well, if I'm right, then let this carob tree outside, walk 30 cubits, and the tree gets up and walks 30 cubits, and the other guy's like, how is that a good argument?
Ha!
Right? It gets worse. Like, and then it escalates because it's a story. It's like the aqueduct runs backwards, and then the aqueduct runs backwards. He's like, since when do we get proof from an aqueduct about your own? And then finally, like, the voice of God comes down and is like, he's right. And then like the guy yells back at him, and he says, these words that we said, it's a line from the Torah where it says, it's not in heaven, meaning like God gave the Torah to people. God can't then like come down and revise the Torah, because that would imply that God didn't get the Torah right the first time. Like, was like got a crappy writer and like has to come back and like edit. Like, no, the idea is like God gave the Torah to the people, and now it's like it's up to us to like figure this out. Like, you can't like intervene and be like, oh, that's not what I meant. Right? Like, because then that would undermine the whole idea of like this human partnership. So like, I mean, it is like a very deep idea. So it is like, it's not even like that God comes down and like tells you the answer. Like, even that doesn't work. So I mean, I think that's sort of interesting, but like I think when it's sort of, it's giving you a sort of a different kind of, it's leading you as a reader to a different place where you're expected to like live with ambiguity, right? And like to like sort of like find a way to thrive within tensions, thrive within ambiguity, and thrive within pluralism, right? Like when I say pluralism, I don't necessarily mean like, in the way we think of it in America, like with people of different ethnic backgrounds or something, but like thrive within like a plurality of points of view. Right.
And understanding or in explanations and theories of the world.
Yes, right. That there's like a lot of competing theories and like none of them are winning.
And sometimes they're utterly irreconcilable.
Yes.
Reading it made me think of A Serious Man, which is probably the Coen brothers' best movie. And it's possibly the most Jewish film in that sense. It just leaves you hanging there in total inexplicability and uncertainty, both in the inscrutable Yiddish opening and in the ending.
Well, but it's the book of Job, right? That's from the biblical book of Job, because at the end, when the tornado comes, that's the voice from the Sarah, that's the voice from the whirlwind.
Right, but it doesn't resolve anything.
Right, exactly. There. And the voice from the whirlwind in Job doesn't resolve anything either. Like, Job is like, why is this happening to me? And God's answer is like, I made giraffes. That's actually God's answer. It's like, dude, I made giraffes.
Can you balance the sky?
You can't do that. And I made giraffes. And like,
No, but Job gets a denouement.
Not real. Well, and he does, but it's like it's so absurd that like you're not really.
He gets like, here, compensatory kids and
it's
wives.
So ridiculous that like you can't take it seriously. It's like, and then he got like he got all new children. Like no adult reader is going to read that and not think that's meant to be. I mean, I think it's almost meant to be funny, right? It's like, and then everything was all better because like he got all new kids, and then things were great.
Yeah, it's like the addendum for Ecclesiastes. It's like, okay, so we're good now.
Right.
So my last question is: did you read Chagnon's the Mistress and the Merchant? Because I think it almost ties in everything we talked about.
I don't know this one, although I've
so I'll just tell you about it briefly. I might even read it, but yeah, it's one of my favorite shorts. Probably my favorite short is Fahrenheit, by the way. But this is like a 3-page story, and it tells about a merchant who's like just traveling, selling his wares, and he meets this beautiful widow who's the mistress of the grand manor, and she takes him in, and she feeds him and dresses him up and takes care of him, and he basically starts living there. It's described that he takes off his merchant tatters and dons the garments of freedom. And he gets a taste of what it's like to be a free man. He's assimilated. He no longer needs to wander the world aimlessly. He has a place. He has a home. And then one night she comes into his room and tries to eat him alive. Just straight up, she reveals her fangs and then launches at him and tries to devour him. They fight. Somehow he manages to escape with everything intact. And then he just moves on with his life and goes back to being a merchant. Like nothing has happened. Nothing changed. There's no personal growth.
No, right.
He doesn't even have the lesson of, next time I'm not going to go into a mistress that allures me with assimilation. Oh, maybe the next one will be nicer.
Maybe.
He's just, that was that. And back he goes. It's like there's no indication that he learned anything or changed anything. No, somebody just tried to eat me, I guess.
That's excellent.
Back to being a merchant. So I just feel like this, in some literary sense, connects all the threads that we've been talking about.
Oh, yeah, I don't know that particular story, but I love Ugnon.
He is. He's something else. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for this fantastic book.
Oh, thank you.
It's great to have something so provocative that you can't put it down.
And you're like, I feel like I have to take the cover off when I read it in public.
I love that title.
Are you kidding me? I'm going to put this jacket on other books
okay,
just to see how many eyes I can turn.
Yeah. Well, that's like for like one thing I was joking about. So my podcast, it's called Adventures with Dead Jews, and it's totally different stories, but it's the same premise. It's like the same sort of concept, but unfortunately, as I put it in the podcast, like the world's love of dead Jews is far too vast for one book to contain. So like, we already have one season of the podcast that, and one of the things like the producers and I are constantly joking about it. So I'm like, it's time to make merch. Right? Like what we really need is like, you know, Adventures with Dead Jews beach towel, right? Like no one's taking your seat at the pool with that, right?
Oh my God, if I were
bag,
travel mug, yep.
People love Dead Jews tote bags. Yes. No one's taking that on the seat, like no one's taking it.
As an Israeli, my capacity for dark Holocaust humor is infinite, so I would
say like for like all Jews, that is infinite. Yeah.
Dara, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you again. Appreciate
it. This is wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcasts. We are Uncertain Pod on the social media, and if you're feeling generous, please give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts because that helps a lot. Share us with your friends and enemies, and until next time, stay sane.